So the most important thing for me today is to answer any questions that you guys have. If you've got anything that you're thinking about in terms of course choice, university choice, you may be thinking about student life, accommodation, student finance, or the actual UCAS application itself, which we'll be talking about. Please do prepare some questions for the end so we can answer any specific queries you've got. So I work within UCL's Access and Widening Participation Office. We're primarily looking at how we can get students from state schools or disadvantaged backgrounds into university, what kind of skills and advice and guidance they'll need for that. So that's kind of perspective I'm coming from today. Can I get a sense, actually, first of all, what we're saying in the room? So could you put your hands up if you're definitely going to apply to university next year? Fab, majority of us. Could you put your hands up if you're thinking about applying to university, you still want a bit more information, you're not quite sure yet, might be considering other options? Cool, few of us. Can I see your hands up if you're definitely not university? No one's a definitely not, that's cool. What about course choice? So put your hand up if you definitely know what course you're going to apply for or selection of courses. So less of us, which is what I'd expect at this point. Hands up if you're maybe picking between two courses that are quite different at the minute, 2 or 3 or more. Fab. And put your hands up if you've no idea what course you want to do, you just know you want to go to uni. Okay, interesting. Good to know. And I think as much as today I'm going to focus on taking you through the essential things with the UCAS process and personal statements, that course choice is going to be one of your most important things, and that's going to be reflected in your personal statement as well. We want to see students who have like a real passion and motivation, enthusiasm for the subject they're going to study. So we'll start off with a bit of an introduction to UCAS and what it is. Does anyone want to tell me what UCAS stands for? Or have a go? It's not on there, is it? No. Anyone want to have a go at telling me what UCAS stands for? Feel free to shout out. Yeah, go for it. Perfect. University and Colleges Admissions Service. So UCAS is your kind of one-stop shop for applying to universities in the UK. On there, you're going to have a complete directory of all the courses that are on offer. It's also where you're going to send all 5 of your university applications to those universities as well. So you'll fill out one application, so you've got one personal statement to write for all of those choices. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. So you apply on UCAS, it'll be October for those of you thinking of doing medicine, dentistry, Oxford, Cambridge, veterinary med, and January next year for those of you who are applying to other places. Those applications we then sent to your universities and admissions tutors who are subject specialists within that university will make their decisions. Where required, you might have an interview. So any of you considering doing medicine, you'll probably have an interview. Oxford and Cambridge usually interview for subjects. There'll be some outliers as well. So for example, English at UCL interviews. So check if your course choices have an interview in that admissions process as well. Make sure you're not surprised by anything after submitting that application. So following maybe an interview, maybe admissions test, submitting a piece of work to the university, you'll get your outcome. And there's 3 options for this. So we've got a conditional offer where you've got an offer to the university, but it's going to be reliant on what grades you get at the end of college or sixth form. We have unconditional offers where there's no condition, you've got a place at the university and you're definitely confirmed, and we'll talk about those a bit later. Or you could be unsuccessful, and for this year you've got no places. And all your decisions can be tracked online on UCAS tracks, so everything is in one place and you'll get notified every time a decision's been made. So in terms of some do's for UCAS, and I think one of the most important things you could take away from tonight's presentation at this point in the application process is really research your course. Does anyone want to have again, shout some numbers out. How many university courses do you think there are in the UK? 16,000, higher than 16,000. That's it, 50? Yeah, pretty much. There's just over 50,000, so points at the back for getting that right on the second guess. So there's over 50,000 courses in UK universities altogether. That might sound like a massive number, but the first thing to consider is that maths at Manchester is not going to be the same as maths at Leeds. Universities aren't governed by a national curriculum. They can teach what they want. So you will find that even courses with the same course title are going to have very different content. They're going to maybe teach some different things. Your choice of modules be different. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider is there's so many more subjects available to you when you're applying to universities rather than at sixth form or college level. So there's going to be subjects you've never heard of before. For example, we've got a new degree at UCL in AI and robotics, which is based on our UCL East campus in Stratford. So that's an example of a course that you might not have considered you could do. The other thing to think about then is also year abroad or year in industry. How long do you want the course to be, and what qualifications specifically do you want at the end of it? So if you're an engineer, you might be thinking about doing a master's in engineering so you can get qualified to go into certain engineering jobs at the end of that process. So there's lots to think about here. It's not as simple as being like, I really like history. We've got to start really looking at what individual university is offering on their history course. We also recommend you be realistic. So we've got 5 choices on UCAS. We want you to aim high as possible. So for 2 of those choices, picking grades that are going to be you on your best day, your best performance, you could get that university offer. We then want a couple of choices to be what you're kind of performing at on average at the moment. So 2 choices which you feel pretty confident you could definitely achieve the grades for. And then maybe 1 choice that's a bit below average. So if there was a chance that something goes wrong on exam day or whatever it is, you still have an option for university if you want to go this year. And definitely be aware of additional requirements. So anyone, put your hands up if you're applying for medicine or law. Now put your hands up if you think you're applying for maths. So what those subjects tend to have in common is that they've got admissions tests associated with them. So for medicine, you're wanting to think about the BMAT or the UCAT and sitting both of those exams before applying. For maths, you might be thinking of doing STEP afterwards, and maybe that's a condition of that course. So thinking about those additional requirements that you'll need to fulfil. Anyone applying to Oxford and Cambridge for especially humanities and arts subjects, they usually ask for essays to be put in at the point of application as well. So there might be some things that you have to achieve on that course to get in. So again, as much as we're researching courses, finding out what modules are on offer, also being aware of any additional requirements. Use the full space on your form. We're going to go into more depth about the personal statement shortly, but you haven't got a lot of room on that UCAS form. So utilise all the room that you've got. Make sure that you're communicating to that university who you are, what you've achieved and why you want to go. Check your form carefully. It can be really easy to miss things like spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes. It's not the end of the world if there's a small grammar mistake that you notice in your personal statement after it's been sent off. But I do recommend getting a friend, a guardian to check over and just make sure that UCAS form and personal statement is as perfect as it can be. And use all of UCAS's resources online, how to apply, make sure you're fulfilling all the steps, you've got all the advice and guidance that you need to make a successful application. And in terms of our don'ts for UCAS, so we don't recommend you apply widely for differing courses. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of course, you've got one personal statement sent to all 5 universities. So it's got to make sense to all of those universities when you write your personal statement. So for example, it wouldn't be appropriate to apply for English at one uni or biology at another, because it might just not make sense why those courses relate. But in terms of if you're applying for, say, a social sciences course, that course title might be different at other universities, and admissions tutors do understand this, so please be reassured about that. We also don't recommend you necessarily apply to the same institution 5 times. From my perspective, that's partially because you've got so much choice ahead of you. It's an exciting time to start thinking about maybe where you want to live and what you want your life to look like for the next few years. So have a look at different unis, see what's on offer and get a sense for what works for you. But also another point to this as well is it's unlikely that one institution is going to have 5 courses similar enough for that personal statement to make sense. So please bear that in mind. And again, I'll bring it back round to course choice being your most important thing. And most importantly, don't forget the application deadlines. I know these have been a bit different because of COVID this year, but I think they'll go back to normal in the year that you're applying. So again, for medicine, dentistry, veterinary sciences, Oxford and Cambridge, it's going to be the 15th of October. And for all other programmes, it'll be the 15th of January. On a personal note as well, I don't recommend you leave your UCAS form to the very last minute. As you might expect, the UCAS website tends to crash on both of these deadline days. So just be aware of that. Make sure you get it done in time. Check with your school as well. Often schools have earlier deadlines. So as much as possible, make year 13 the least stressful it can be for you and prepare in advance. And you're doing that now because you're here so much in advance talking about personal statements. So we're going to move on and talk a bit about the actual statement itself and what admissions tutors are looking for when they're assessing university applications. So I think there's this idea that you've got to make your application stand out from the crowd. I always am a bit curious of that phrase purely because I don't think you have to do anything, I don't think you have to go anywhere exceptional necessarily or do anything that no one else has done to demonstrate you want to do that subject. What admissions tutors are looking for more is that we've got a candidate who's got a deep interest in the subject and they're able to demonstrate that. We want to see people who have reflected on their subject outside of school time and they're clearly doing things that indicate that, and we'll go into some examples of this later. So we'll run through some of these and what they mean and what they mean for admissions tutors. So just to recap, admissions tutors are these subject specialists that work in each faculty within a university. So they'll often be responsible for doing research or teaching the subject itself, and they'll be the people that are assessing your application. So these are experts in their field. So that what they're looking for in you, first of all, is your academic ability. So they want to see that so far your academic attainment shows that you're going to be able to get the grades required of you for that university offer. So that's the first thing. But then we want to see things like a deep interest in subject and motivation and enthusiasm for the study, and understanding of what that degree is going to entail, which is what you're going to start communicating for your personal statement. We're also looking for some transferable skills as well. So we'll talk about how I kind of recommend you structure your personal statement and what kind of balance you should have. But with things that you might be doing in school or outside of school, your kind of extracurriculars, we want to see someone who has transferable skills that are going to make sure they adapt well for study. So things like critical thinking or time management, communication, your ability to work independently, things like that. I think it's worth saying as well, no one's expecting you to be finished products just yet. That's the reason you're going to university and going into higher education and actually deciding to learn more. So we're not expecting you to be finished. I'm definitely still working on some of these transferable skills myself, but it's basically getting across the promise that you're going to, try hard at university, you're going to be able to adapt to that higher level of study, and you're capable of making that quite tough transition sometimes. And alongside this as well, going along with demonstrating your taking part in extracurriculars or things outside of school. We're also looking for you to contribute outside of the classroom as well. So universities are centred around student life. We have clubs and societies at most universities where students can get together over some serious things, some more kind of like fun and silly things as well, and basically contribute to that university culture. And as a student at university, you'll be able to go to your students' union and get funding for anything, any club and society you want to set up, things like that. So we want to see people who are going to contribute to that and are interested in coming to university and making it a vibrant, fun place. So your personal statement itself, so it's only 47 lines, 4,000 character limit. Just to note there as well, that's not words, it's characters. So like each individual bit of punctuation is also going to come into that word count. So it really isn't a lot of space. It's roughly one side of A4. And within that, you've got to demonstrate to this university why it is you're the best person for that course, why you really want to study it, what's motivated you to study it, what examples have you got of it, and then a bit about your extracurriculars as well. So it's a lot to fit in. That's the first thing to know. We'll start off with some general tips. So firstly, don't plagiarise. Universities these days have really advanced plagiarism checkers. So if you've just taken and copied and pasted something from the internet, they'll probably be able to tell. The other point about that as well is it's a personal statement, and it does come across much better when we can get a sense of, someone's voice, and we get a sense of what that individual themselves telling us why they want to do that particular course. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is avoiding cliches. We've got some really faint examples on the screen, but these are things like, ever since a young age, I wanted to study English, things like that. It's not that that might not be true for you and you did want to study English from a young age, but it's a kind of general line that doesn't really tell us much about actually why you want to study that subject. And it's something that, again, imagine these admissions tutors reading over hundreds and hundreds of applications. We want it to stand out in a way where we're not just repeating the same lines, basically. So try and avoid things like these. And as I'll touch on later, coming up with really robust examples of why you want to study that subject. And finally, the structure. So what we recommend, and I think this is going to be really important for those of you who are looking at those more competitive universities as well, is really focusing the personal statement on why you want to study the degree. And then that extracurricular bit at the bottom where you're demonstrating transferable skills is going to take up roughly 20 or 30% of that personal statement. So primarily what we want to be seeing is reasons for why you want to study the degree, and we want to see evidence of those reasons as well. So we'll go into actually structuring the personal statement. And before I go into this, so it is February, you might forget a lot of this talk before you actually come to maybe drafting a personal statement in the summer or thinking about it at the start of year 13. So I want to say before I start this bit that I think another key takeaway that you should take from this is how you're going to start forming examples of demonstrating your subject interest. I think that's the most important thing to take away from tonight. That's something that I expect you'll be doing over the coming months when you are deciding a university course. So that's just a little caveat. So we'll focus firstly on the actual body of the personal statement and what I'm kind of talking about when I'm saying about examples of all these things. So with the bulk of your personal statement, we want 4 or 5 paragraphs about what attracts you to the subject. So what is it about that subject that you really like? Why do you want to study it? What have you done outside of the classroom and in the classroom to demonstrate that you wanted to learn more about it? Any particular areas of interest you've got? So any subjects or modules or topics you found particularly interesting about that subject, anything you're particularly keen to develop in a higher education capacity. Experience of the subject area as well, and especially beyond the curriculum. So this might look like work experience for some of you. Again, I'd like to say you don't have to do work experience for the vast majority of subjects. It's mostly just medicine, I think, where they're really requiring some work experience out of you. But generally what we're looking for is that you've sat at least in your bedroom, you listened to some podcasts, you watched some documentaries, you read some books, and you've thought about the subject outside of the classroom when no one's telling you to do it. And that's where you're really going to start demonstrating that subject interest and that enthusiasm and motivation. This is a really key thing as well. So you might be thinking, you know, I'm really interested in a subject. I want to apply for it at university. I've not really explored it outside the classroom just yet. I've not really got round to any podcasts, documentaries, books, whatever it might be. That's absolutely fine. You've got plenty of time to start researching. Something key about that is if you are doing this subject exploration outside the classroom and you think this is really, really boring, you might want to think what other courses might suit you a bit more. Actually really enjoying the subject is what's going to get you through university, but also that will come across in your personal statement as well. So make sure you're enjoying that process of actually finding out more about the subject, and that will give you a good indication for those of us not really sure about what course we want to do yet of what you actually might want to study. And then finally, you're going to have a paragraph at the end of that body of the personal statement on extracurricular activities. So what are you up to? Have you got any responsibilities inside school? What do you think these have taught you? Are there any skills that really jump out as of these extracurriculars as going to be really useful for university? So those transferable skills. And depending on how your brain works, you might want to write the body first and then do the introduction or conclusion. I think that's what people generally tend to recommend. And generally what we're looking for in introduction and conclusion is to summarise in as few words as possible the overall reason for why you want to do the subject. That can be a really good exercise to start getting you thinking about writing your personal statement. So trying to summarise in one line all of your reasons for wanting to do that subject, for example. But this is something you might actually do after you've written the vast bulk of your personal statement. And then in your conclusion, recapping your main point. So it's basically like any essay you would write in school. Recapping your main point of why you want to apply, maybe with an additional example, you might choose to do that. I will say as well, you know, this is a recommended structure. It is a personal statement, as I keep saying. So what you kind of want to bring to it and what you think shows off your personal interest and your personality is absolutely fine. And again, one of the other really important points that I have for this evening is don't say it, show it. So we don't want to just get a list of things that you've done. We want to get in one example of something that you particularly liked doing outside of school, a particularly good book that you read on the subject you're applying for, and tell us what was interesting about it. What did you find out? How did this expand your understanding of the subject, and why has it made you want to study it further? So we're wanting to see that you're demonstrating an interest and an ability rather than just listing us reasons for it. So for example, to demonstrate that motivation, interest or understanding, you're going to do that because you've actually gone on maybe a taster day where you went to a university and you got to have a little taster lecture on a subject that you're really interested in. That's what really enthused you. So then from that taster day, what about that topic was particularly interesting to you? So that's one way that you might demonstrate that motivation and interest, because we can see that you're going to things and actively pursuing opportunities that are related to that subject. Things like masterclasses as well, so I can provide some links to some of these that we've got coming up at UCL, online masterclasses for courses as well. So please do come and ask about those if you're interested. But like I said, you don't necessarily have to go anywhere or do anything, so a bit of wider reading. Again, if you're not a reader, then thinking about podcasts, documentaries, other formats that you can get that information in. You live in London, so there's lots of museums. So you might want to get yourself in central London, have a look at some exhibits, maybe related to your course. See if that brings up anything interesting when you're exploring that subject. And any relevant work experience is obviously great. But again, with work experience, it's not just enough to say that you've done it. We want to see, we want to demonstrate what we've actually learned from it and what it brought to building up our motivation, enthusiasm for that subject. And again, with the transferable skills, so it's not enough to just say, I'm really good at independent learning, or I'm a super critical thinker, or I'm excellent at time management. We're thinking about, showing that you've got balancing multiple priorities at once. So whilst you're in school, doing sixth form and college and getting those qualifications that you need, are you also volunteering or doing some extracurricular activities as well to demonstrate you can balance your time? Hobbies and interests, so what are you actually up to when you're not studying or relaxing? So reflecting on what you've learned through these experiences. And we will do some example of these to demonstrate what I mean by that shortly, right now. Perfect. So I'm going to read out 3 segments from real personal statements we've had to UCL. And you guys are going to tell me what you think of them and where we think we can be improved, what we think is good about them, things like that. So please, again, feel free to shout out after I've read them out. So the first one is Nazi Germany, Stalin's Russia, the Second World War, the Georgian and Victorian periods, the American civil rights movements, and Mao's China are all historical periods that I'm incredibly familiar with and knowledgeable about. Again, feel free to shout out, what do we think about this one? Go for it. Sorry. It's bursting, would you say? Yeah, I think that's a really good point, yeah. Absolutely, it's pretty much just a list of topics. Any other thoughts on this one? Yeah. Absolutely. So they've just said, I'm knowledgeable, but nothing's actually demonstrating to us that they necessarily are. We've not learned anything more about these topics in the paragraph. Yeah. Exactly. I think that is a really good point. So you're knowledgeable already. You've learned all this stuff. So what is about history that's actually, I'm assuming it's history, and what about that is actually intriguing you to want to go on and study it further? Any other points on this one? Yeah. It is, yeah, and I think this is why it's good to get your friends or like teachers or whatever to read that personal statement, because we might write this and not realise that it's a really, really long sentence. So we might want to break things up a bit. But like you've said before, it's essentially just a list. Any other thoughts on it? The topics maybe that they're bringing up? Has anyone got any thoughts on that? Yeah. Say that again, sorry. Yeah, I would agree, like awkwardly worded, totally. Yeah, it doesn't really sound like someone's voice as well, and we'll talk about one with kind of voice in a minute as well, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so you've got 2 points there. Firstly, universities might not solely focus on these topics as well. All good, Dory. As well, these are really, really common topics at, A-level or GCSE history. It's not necessarily demonstrating you've done anything outside of the classroom. And then you do, as you rightly mentioned, you want to take maybe one example out of these and then pull it out a bit more. So maybe you would just pick the Georgian period, for example, and tell us why you think that part of history is particularly fascinating, what conclusions can be drawn about it, what does it tell us about the world that we live in now or the world back then. So yeah, absolutely, everyone made great points on that one. So it's just a list. It's a list of really common topics at sixth form and GCSE, so there's no evidence you've done anything outside the classroom. It's really wordy. It doesn't necessarily sound like a natural voice that someone might use. And finally, it would be much better to pick one example and then really go into depth about what you've learned about it and where you've taken that study outside the classroom. So fantastic on that one. The second one is, I'm going to take a breath for this one. My attendance at a UCL summer school in 2011 provided me with an invaluable insight into life at university, and I later attended a history conference which focused on human rights and slavery, and it covered topics from eugenics and the French Revolution to Jeremy Bentham. This has increased my curiosity and has allowed me to delve deeper into the study of human history and observe human behaviour, which is fundamental in evaluating past events. Cool. So any thoughts on this one? Good, bad, whatever? Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. No one picks up on that. As you can see, this onto the next page, up to Jeremy Bentham, is just one sentence. Again, this is a really common mistake we might not notice in our own work, but it doesn't read really well. As I said before, it's not going to be the be-all and end-all if you have one lengthy sentence in your personal statement. So don't worry about it if you submitted it and that happens. But generally, getting someone to read over it for you, reading things out loud can be really helpful as well. So just making sure you're kind of doing your diligence and checking over. But I think, as you touched on, there's like good parts of it as well. So have we got any other thoughts about this one? Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I totally agree. So we don't really get a sense of, so we've got like invaluable insight, but that's a bit vague, like could go like more into depth with that. And again, one example that doesn't really demonstrate anything, and moving on to another one. I do think what's really good about this one is it talks about delving deeper into human history, observing human behavior. It's demonstrating, you know, like what actually the study of history is beneficial for and why someone might want to study it. But again, it could go into more depth, and there's an example that's kind of just left on that part of the statement without really expanding it much. Any other thoughts on this one? Cool. I think we can agree this one's much better than the first ones. We've got, you know, one example or two examples. It's gone a bit more in depth, and we're thinking a bit more about actually why someone might want to study history when we're reading it. But again, bit of a grammar mistake. So again, just getting people to read over that and being aware of it. I'm terrible for like long sentences. So it's not a reflection on you or like whether you should go to uni, but it just can help. If you get someone to read over, you read it out loud, just to make sure it's the best it can possibly be. So the final example of this, I was fortunate enough to secure an extremely prestigious work experience placement, during which time I was afforded the opportunity to observe multiple and diverse client consultations. Yeah, totally. Super vague. Like, what was the work experience? What were the opportunities it had? Who were the clients? What were actually the client consultations about? Like, I have no sense of, I feel like if you take an excerpt of your personal statement, you should generally know at least what subject area you're looking at. But with this one, I wouldn't actually be able to tell you at all. So it's super vague to start off with. Yeah. Totally. Super wordy. Does anyone feel like they kind of talk like this in the real life? I certainly don't. So yeah, it's super wordy. It's maybe using words that someone might not naturally use. If you do talk like this, that's great. Like, please do communicate your personal statement in your kind of natural voice. But we're not looking at universities for people who are, you know, I don't want to say super fancy, but we're looking for people with genuine interest for their subject. And I think generally using standard English, communicate in a way that feels comfortable to you. Obviously, it's a formal piece of writing. So, you know, using slang might not necessarily come around well unless maybe you're talking about slang in a linguistics context. But yeah, it's not necessarily true to someone's own voice. So really think about that as well. Don't think you have to come across or present yourself in a certain way. We want to see essentially that motivation, enthusiasm for study. Any other thoughts on this one? Yeah. Totally, yeah. And again, you're not like, so you're saying it feels a bit boastful, saying extremely prestigious. And I do agree. I don't think, again, you don't have to position yourself or promote yourself in a certain light. We're looking, again, as I was saying before, you don't have to leave your bedroom to do any of this research outside of the classroom. You can literally do everything from home. We're not looking for a certain type of person. We're looking for someone who's genuinely motivated and interested in that subject. So yeah, fantastic on that one. The main things being the voice that it's talking in, really, really vague, not actually telling us anything about the subject you're applying for. But mostly, yeah, true to your own voice, I think is the biggest thing from there. So I am going to wrap up with a few conclusions now. Again, I'd love to get around to like questions and what you guys are kind of thinking about at this point in the application process. But just to recap, check your grammar and spelling mistakes. Have a really clear structure that's easy to follow and make it easy to read. Again, these admission tutors going to be reading so many applications, but like standard English, as like simple as possible to read and kind of follow through. And again, so it doesn't get confusing and we lose the actual point of what you're trying to say about the subject you're applying for. Back up what you're saying with examples, the most important thing. So for those of us who haven't done any of that subject exploration yet, start thinking of examples of what you've done and what you found interesting of it. I would really recommend like keeping a little notebook or something on your computer or phone that just has examples of what you've actually done, what you think you benefited from doing it, what ideas you found particularly interesting. So start doing that now. You will thank yourself when you come to write in that statement. standard English that is true to your own voice. It's a formal piece of writing, but we do want to hear from you, and we're not expecting you to speak or communicate in any one way. Everyone does that differently. And ask someone else to read it, get a second opinion from a friend, and make sure it reads well and it's the best advertisement of you and why you want to study that course as possible. Lovely. So I'm going to wrap up here to start taking some questions, which again, like if you've got anything to ask now, please do. I will be hanging around as well, so you can ask more questions afterwards if you'd prefer to come up and do it in private. But yeah, over to you guys. I've got a hand there. There's no change in personal statements projected, so it will be exactly the same as it has been in previous years. So in terms of like format, what you're expecting to fill out, as far as I know, should all be the same. I always like to say as well, make sure you're looking things up on the internet, do your own research, trust what's on the UCAS website, but I've not heard any kind of projected changes. Yeah. Great question. So that's anyone applying for joint honours and you've got to balance two subjects in your personal statement. I applied for a joint honours, so I feel the kind of struggle of this. It can be really hard. First of all, as I said before, admission tutors will understand if the personal statement comes across like it's kind of split, because they understand obviously there's so many different courses out there. I think the best things to do is try and look at what you're studying right now and reflect on why that's benefited both of those subjects in some way. So it might be directly related to the subject, but there also might be some transferable skills to think about as well. And within those examples, I think try and draw out multiple things from them. So what kind of subjects are you thinking of, just out of interest? Law and sociology. So you can already see there's two links between law and sociology as subjects, what they might do in the world. So start thinking about why you want to study both of those in tandem, why you're not just picking one over the other, and why you think they'd be useful together as well. We have like a chemistry and French course at UCL, which I always think like must be a really hard personal statement to write, but maybe thinking about how those things might link together and what kind of crossover those subjects have, I think is a really good place to start. Good question. Yeah. It's a good question. I couldn't give you a strict character amount for how many should be in your introduction and conclusion. I would say it's not going to be the focus of your personal statement, and it really just wants to briefly summarise the body of your personal statement. So I couldn't give you a number, but a couple, 3 sentences max maybe for your introduction and conclusion. Again, you've got such limited space, making sure that you're dedicating most of that to the examples that you're giving as well. Good question. Yeah. Sure. That's a good question. So what university are you applying for the integrated course at? Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So generally what I find, so if it's a medicine application, with the UCL medicine course, the integrated aspect of it isn't necessarily something they're going to judge admission on. It's a really great aspect of the course, but they won't necessarily be asking you exactly what you're going to study during that integrated year just yet necessarily. So I think I would consider it briefly, if all of your other courses don't have that opportunity to do like a different subject in a different year, I would focus it primarily on what the majority of those subjects have. If you've got some ideas about what you might want to explore on that intercalated year, and if it does in any way relate to medicine, then it can be a really nice thing to mention. But I wouldn't worry about it too much where you're stressing that you've not included enough about it. But I think you touch on another key thing, which I'd remind everyone as well, is you're looking at the course structure really early on. You're aware of what that course is going to expect of you. And that, again, is a really good thing to come across in personal statements and your application. Fab. Question at the back. Say that again, sorry. To you guys. Oh, but real personal statements, those ones. Oh, I don't know. We picked them out, admission sheets are giving them. I'm not necessarily sure whether they got places. So I couldn't give you there is no set formula though on like what personal statement is going to get a place. We're obviously looking at applications holistically, considering a lot of different factors. So I couldn't tell you that, unfortunately. But generally just as some tips, it's good to take note of. Fab. Any other questions? Yeah? Good question. I think Absolutely, yeah. So you asked how, if the personal statement is like the most important part of the application, essentially, compared to the other parts. This is going to really depend on the university you're applying to, what other aspects of the application you have to submit. I couldn't give you any one answer for any one university. They're all going to do that process slightly differently. I think it's worth considering. They will take in to consideration contextual information about your application. So they'll be thinking about what school you go to, how you're performing on average compared to the average of that school. So they will be considering multiple factors, but I couldn't say whether one university is going to value it over another. So it's really going to depend. If you're interested to find out what the admissions office at each university thinks about that, email them, get in touch, ask them. That's my general advice as well. Don't be afraid to get in touch and ask questions to universities if you're interested, but I couldn't give you one definitive answer for any university. Any other questions? Yeah. Cool. So is there anything you can do to increase your chance of getting a conditional offer? Conditional offers, again, that's going to be down to universities. Some universities give them out more than others. Most universities are going to be wanting you to have your A-level grades for a conditional offer already. And most universities have grade choices built on a conditional offer as well. So actually getting an unconditional offer to a university, it's going to depend on the university themselves and whether they give out a lot of them. It might depend on course vacancies for that year. I wouldn't rely on it in any way. And generally with unconditional offers, if you do get one, it's obviously great that it takes so much stress off, but I always advise putting is your insurance, because you actually don't know if you're going to need your A-levels ever again in your life. You might change your mind in a few years about what you want to do. So don't rely completely on them and don't act like they're going to be a guarantee, because most universities don't do them. Cool, a question there? So usually it's the university that decides. So some universities will only take A-level grades, for example, or they'll only take like BTEC grades. Others will do a combination of UCAS points and A-levels depending on what that person's studying. So it's a really good thing to kind of mark out and have an eye on as well. Generally, you might find some universities, I know Oxford and Cambridge do this, where they just don't accept like UCAS points, for example. There'll be a few universities like that. So it's going to come down to whatever you're sitting at the minute. So obviously, if you're sitting A-levels, that's absolutely fine. If you're doing different qualifications, you'll want to calculate that into UCAS points for that university. But generally, if it says both are there, then it's going to accept them in whatever form. So it's just going to come down to whatever you're studying. So yeah, have a look at UCAS point calculators as well. Make sure that you know how many you'd be projected to come out with if you've got a university basing their offers on that. But if it says both on the website, then it's going to be both. It just depends what you're studying.